Hello and welcome to the Axe Synergy Show, the show where you send the questions and we give the answers. My name is Anson Cooley and I'm the principal at Synergy Credit Union Consulting. This particular show concept has been on my heart for a long time. I initially wanted to do it as a podcast where I had multiple guests. I wanted to have all these different kinds of fancy graphics and things of that nature. And what ends up happening is I send out a lot of feelers to different clients and different folks, asking them for questions. And then all the other fancy stuff that I was trying to do just it was slowing me down. And I had all these questions that I hadn't gotten to. And so what I wanted to do is just jump straight in. We'll improve everything as we push forward with the graphics and having everything organized in point one, point two, and point three. But what I wanted to do is just really dive into the people who sent me in questions that are pertinent to them and their credit union at this point in time. So let's get started. Our first question comes from a mid-sized credit union that's thinking about implementing a board term limit process. And so the question came from a board chair, and this individual wanted to know what are the pros and the cons of doing it. What are some of the things they can do to implement the process, and just do we have any best practices? So here's what I think. First, let me say that not everyone is agreeable to term limits. Actually, in a lot of ways, it's a non-starter for a lot of board members. I've gone into strategic planning sessions where we were having a good time the entire session, but the moment I suggested that perhaps the board consider implementing a term limits, the entire energy in the room shifted. And because some board members feel as though the ballot box is their term limits and they don't have an appreciation for what term limits can do for the organization at large. At least that's my perception of it, as opposed to seeing it as an attack on them as an individual because of their age or how long they've been on the committee. Term limits have to be seen, or term limits have to be dealt with within the larger context of board succession planning. You can't have a conversation around term limits without also addressing succession. And you really can't have a conversation around board succession without addressing the board evaluation process. Okay. So what we're really talking about is improving your organization's board governance. And a lot of organizations look past this because they say, well, these are volunteers. Why should we put any more pressure or onus on them to do these things? But one of the things that's important for this movement to realize is that board members are stewards of those credit unions' assets. They don't own them. And what can happen in institutions where that don't have board term limits, those individuals sitting in those seats could start thinking that they own the seat. I mean, have you ever tried to get a group of board members to switch seats? You know, Greg sits right here every meeting, Patricia sits here. I mean, they don't even want to play musical chairs, right? And so, in order to change that culture, board term limits go a long way in communicating that you're a steward of the seat. You're holding on to it, but it does not necessarily belong to you as an individual. Okay. And so, as you can see, I'm a proponent of it. Or you can see that I'm a proponent of board term limits, and I'm agreeable to them. But let's just talk about some of the cons real quick so we can be fair and balanced. What I want to do with the Axe Synergy show is give both perspectives of most of the questions that are being posed. Term limits could potentially create a brain drain in your board if not prepared for properly, meaning if all of a sudden you have an individual that is a very good board member who terms out, there could be a situation where you're missing that individual and the talent and the knowledge that they bring to the institution. One of the ways that you can avoid this is through planning for it. Okay, meaning you should stagger out the terms in which certain board members roll off the committee so that you don't have 4 or 5 strong board members rolling off at the same time. And when I said that board term limits should be dealt with within the context of the larger board succession planning process, what I'm saying is this: you should do, in conjunction with your strategic planning, say, okay, this is what we're planning to do over the next 3 to 5 years. What skills could we use on our board that could help us perhaps better achieve these things? For example, 3 to 4 years ago, preparing for CECL was a big thing. Now that we're getting closer to that implementation, if it ever happens, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we could have said, well, what if we asked the local accounting professor to be on the board, because maybe that individual could add some value to that process of us preparing for CECL. And so taking an inventory of the skill sets that you have on your board and then saying, where do we have a gap, and making sure that the next director that you nominate fulfills that gap. All too often, board of directors don't choose their next board members based on a skill need. They do it based on a fit. Will this person disrupt our chemistry? Okay. Moreover, if I'm speaking to board members in this moment, some CEOs like to fat finger and pick certain board members because they want to make sure that they have a board composition that's agreeable to the things that they want to do. All right. But this process should be driven by the board. And if you're going to do it, you want to make sure that you stagger out, okay, the individuals that are rolling off. What are best practices for term limits? It's different across the board. Some credit unions do 3 terms of 3 years. So, for example, you can serve 3 consecutive years of 3 terms of 3 years, so 9 years, and then you can cool off. Meaning you don't have to leave the credit union, but perhaps maybe for 3 years you can go serve on the supervisory committee and then come back to the board. Some other credit unions do 4 terms of 3 years, and they have them staggered out so that you don't have this large, again, outflow of knowledge that leaves your committee. How do you get this implemented? Well, if you don't have the votes, it's dead in the water, right? There's no way that you can get it done. So in the past, the first thing you can try to do it whereby you implement it with the current individuals, but most of the time that I get this passed through a board is where we grandfather in the existing board members, and every additional board member that comes on after we implement this or ratify this process, that individual now is subject to the term limits going forward. That's how I typically get this approved through a board of directors. In closing, term limits aren't about getting rid of older directors. What it's really about is ensuring that your credit union's board has the skills it needs to properly oversee the strategic direction, risk appetite, and mission of your organization.